So the fun part of testing the mic, let me just play with this a little bit. How's that? Is any mic coming through?
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Thanks, Derek. That was a great sort of pressure-filled introduction. I have to live up to all of those three things. So I see a lot of familiar faces here. I see some unfamiliar faces, which is always fun. By the way, I think Derek said something like, if you're a leftist or environmentalist, like, feel free to argue and ask questions. I intend to convince you during the talk. I'll just, so I'm at least open to that possibility. So I like to do, I've become fond lately of word association games, especially because I don't know most of you. So all I need you to do is just, whatever the first couple words that come to mind when you hear the words Keystone XL Pipeline, just say those, and we'll go around the room and just say whatever comes to mind.
Heavy oil.
Heavy oil. And as just one specification, where possible, make it, adjective descriptions, value-laden, exciting things that we would argue about.
Oh my God.
Okay,
I would say
Obama. Okay.
Resource exploitation.
Resource exploitation. Okay.
Good investment.
Good investment. We're going on. Everyone has to speak.
Environmental
Risk.
danger. Environmental risk.
okay.
Or danger. Yeah.
You said risk.
Okay. Next.
Money. I don't know, but.
Okay.
Efficient.
In the vein of that person, my first reaction was, damn fools!
The foreign processing of the oil.
Foreign processing. And by the way, you're more than welcome to say stuff that other people have said if that's what's on your mind. Next.
Obama and politics.
Okay.
Free trade.
Okay. Rest of you guys have to use adjectives. It makes it spicier.
I don't know, expropriative? I'm not sure.
There's no correct answer. It's just your emotional reaction.
Oh, I didn't have an adjective, so I had to come up with something.
You?
Mine was risk.
Oh, risk. Okay.
An awesome job in my chosen field.
Go ahead. You?
Dirty capitalists, dirty oil.
Dirty oil. Okay.
That's not the first one.
Controversial.
Massive.
Massive. In the back. What? One more time?
Progress?
Progress.
Irrationality.
Irrationality.
I think the most common one is dirty oil, right away.
I have the same answer.
Oily ducks.
Oily ducks. All right. In the back?
Controversial.
Controversial. All right. You three. Derek?
Awesome.
Can't take his, can I?
Yeah, you can.
Awesome.
Opportunity.
Opportunity.
Speaking engagement.
That was one.
How about James Cameron in a helicopter?
Yeah, so one of the people, Ted, whom I know, said dirty oil. Said he thinks is by far the most popular. That is my experience talking to a lot of people about this issue, and I think that's kind of the most important and consequential aspect of this issue, because the reason that this is a controversy, the reason that we're here really, is because there's a major opposition to the Keystone XL pipeline, and the overwhelming reason is environmental. And the way that's usually framed is that it's dirty energy. And coincidentally, or not coincidentally, I was reading this morning, there was a debate between two of the biggest people on this issue, one pro and one con. So the pro guy is a guy named Ezra Levant, who you guys probably know, or many of you are familiar with. And the anti guy is a guy named Bill McKibben, who's a famous environmentalist and also a big guy on this issue. Now, it was on the Huffington Post, and they declared McKibben the winner, so it's,
Yeah,
that's,
right.
but they had a system where it was, you said what you believed before, and then you said what you believed after, and then whoever got the most percentage switch was ranked as winning the debate, but still, it was, I think it could have been a little rigged. But in any case, I actually think that McKibben had the most accurate comment about the state of the debate, and I wrote it down. He made in his thing, he has 16 separate points, which I always find amusing. Like, how are you supposed to remember, like, these are the 16 most important points why Keystone is evil. But the last one basically just summed up everything. He said, everyone knows the biggest reason. This is reason 16. The longer we stay addicted to dirty oil, the longer we delay the transition to the sun, the wind, and myriad other clean ways to power our lives. And this, now, what was interesting about this was Levant's response to this, or how Levant addressed this issue, and I think it's typical of how many of the pro-Keystone people address it, because he certainly didn't say it's not dirty. He didn't say, he certainly didn't say, like the title of my talk says, he didn't say it's clean, he didn't say it's environmentally beneficial, nothing like that. He basically said, well, it's not as dirty as the other guy's saying, and the main thing he focused on was the fact that, well, it's going to be, it's going to be burned anyway. So we've got this oil from oil sands. If we don't use it here, if we don't send it to the U.S. from Canada, I mean, I'm making myself a Canadian right now, but if you don't send it to the U.S. from Canada, then it's just going to be sent to China, and then that'll mean it's going to, even more is going to be burned because it's going to take oil to power the ships and whatnot. And I don't really find that too convincing an argument, because if it's really dirty in the sense that McKibben is talking about, if it's really fundamentally destructive of our environment, then there's a real problem, and we shouldn't just settle for just burning it. We should be taking proactive action. We should be encouraging the rest of the world not to engage in this type of activity. If something is fundamentally destructive, you don't just say, oh, well, someone's going to use it, so it might as well be us. And the way he began was indicative. He said, pay attention to this, it's really interesting. One day, scientists will invent a fuel source that is perfect in every way. And then he says, environmentally sustainable, affordable, practical. So we can replace the imperfect fuels we use now, like oil. Now, when he says perfect in every way, and he says affordable and practical, he's presumably talking about oil, which is definitely affordable and practical compared to just about anything else. But what he's saying is, it's not environmentally sustainable. And my view is, if you take that seriously, like environmentally unsustainable means that we can't sustain a healthy environment using this. That would mean that it was bad. So I actually take a lot of issue with the supposed pro-Keystone side, because I don't think they've really addressed the environmental issue head on. I think it's addressed in a very, very cynical way. And I think that's a shame, because based on my analysis of it, and based on my study of it, I believe that burning oil sands and moving oil sands through pipelines, including the Keystone XL pipeline, is incredibly environmentally beneficial. Now, this might seem implausible, because how does that work? You guys doing okay there? If you can't get it to work, you can turn it off. We have like 8 cameras running simultaneously.
No power left.
Okay, no worries. And because, so this can seem implausible, and I understand, because this is certainly, my background was philosophy, which in one sense has nothing to do with energy, and in one sense has a huge amount to do with energy. And when I first came to study energy, my experience was, my sort of view was, well, oil, it's dirty, and certainly to the extent I knew about oil sands, I mean, so you burn them, and there's a certain amount of just different waste products. There's CO2 emissions to the extent you're concerned about that. And then with oil sands, I mean, you do have a lot of byproduct. I mean, you're dealing with this very, very thick, tarry stuff. And you're using very, very impressive technology to extract valuable oil out of it, but in the process, you're leaving, there's quite a bit of stuff that you don't want generated. It changes the environment that it's in greatly. It's understandable that people think of it as dirty in a certain way. And yet, I would argue that it's not. And actually, the thing that helped me in terms of coming into the field of energy from philosophy is that philosophy is really good, if you get a good philosophy education, which I was fortunate enough to get, is it's really good at helping you step back and think about the way people are thinking about things. Like, are we really thinking about this issue in the right way, or are we just focusing on one thing and missing the big picture? And what I found was exactly that. The way we discuss environment, the way we think of Keystone and environment is making a fatal flaw, which misses the big picture about this oil and its relationship to environment. And so to illustrate this, I want to read to you a story about a form of energy production that is even, quote, dirtier than oil sands. And I want you to just think of one question, answer one question in your own mind when you hear the story. And that is this dirty energy? Some of you may have heard this story before. This is an actual operation in China. On the outskirts of one of China's most polluted cities, an old farmer stares despairingly out across an immense lake of bubbling toxic waste covered in black dust. He remembers it as fields of wheat and corn. I'm skipping ahead. There is, quote, a vast man-made lake of poison in northern China. Hidden out of sight behind smoke-shrouded factory complexes in the city of Baotou and patrolled by platoons of security guards lies a 5-mile-wide tailing lake. It has killed farmland for miles around, made thousands of people ill, and put one of China's key waterways in jeopardy. This vast, hissing cauldron of chemicals is the dumping ground for 7 million tons a year, this material, after it has been doused in acid and chemicals and processed through red-hot furnaces to extract its components. Moving forward, an apocalyptic sight greets us. This is the reporter speaking. A giant, secret, toxic dump made bigger by every this form of energy we build. And then he says, the lake instantly assaults your senses. Stand on the black crust for just seconds and your eyes water and a powerful acrid stench fills your lungs. For hours after our visit, my stomach lurched and my head throbbed. We were there for only an hour, but those who live in Mr. Yan's village of Dalahai and other villages around breathe in the same poison every day. Dalahai villagers say their teeth began to fall out, their hair turned white at unusually young ages, and they suffered from severe skin and respiratory diseases. Children were born with soft bones and cancer rates rocketed. Official studies carried out 5 years ago in the Dalahai village confirmed there were unusually high rates of cancer along with high rates of osteoporosis and skin and respiratory diseases. The lake's radiation levels are 10 times higher than in the surrounding countryside, the studies found. Okay, so a show of hands. How many people would say that this is dirty energy? Okay, how many would say that it's clean energy? Okay, we have one. And then how many would say that you need more information? Oh, you're already, you raise your hand for two things.
We didn't know that would be an option.
Yeah, we didn't know.
That's always an option. Never say yes unconditionally if it's not true.
Yeah, we don't know if that's even the byproduct of anything.
No, well, it's certainly related to energy. I mean, I was telling the truth going in, so I mean, you can take it all as true. So, what I was just describing was the mining process that takes place for the construction of the materials that go into windmills and solar panels. But why am I bringing this up? Is it just to score points against wind and solar? No, I have nothing in particular against generating power from wind or solar panels. It's simply a matter of whether those are efficient. But if anyone here, did anyone coming into this at least before this story I read, did anyone consider yourself a fan of wind power? You can raise your hand. Okay, so in the back, what would you say? Does this make you now oppose wind power?
I need to know more about this excerpt.
Like what?
Which companies would use, first of all, what is being produced?
Okay, so
What
it's,
materials are being produced?
so it's called rare earth elements. So these are, these are very important, especially for magnetic properties and other properties in the construction of modern wind turbines. And there are just inherently very high toxic risks to their production.
And most abundant in China.
What?
They're most abundant.
Yeah, I mean, their abundancy issues are related to both the fact that they're basically banned to mine them in the United States, and then there's a lot of them in China. And they happen to be they're called rare earth, which is a little bit of a misnomer because there are lots of them, but they're kind of spread out in the various materials that they're being mined from. So it's a very energy-intensive process. Did you want to say anything about that?
Is this the only way to manufacture wind turbines? Is the wind turbine at the exhibition place manufactured?
This is the process that's going on overwhelmingly with the wind turbines that if you've advocated them, that's been going on so far. When you hear that they get cheaper, it's often because, Chinese labor is being exploited, in this way. So what do we say? So no wind, is that it? Just because of this example?
Well, can I add something? Well, first of all, I know that wind doesn't produce the same amount of energy that you could create using other sources like nuclear or oil or something. I remember a couple days ago, just for a school project, I calculated, okay, this is how much power Pickering nuclear makes, and this is how large it is. Then if we were to cover an area with 1.8 megawatt wind turbines spaced about 150 meters apart, what sort of an area do we need? And it was like all of downtown, just wind turbines.
Yeah, so that's an issue. We can talk more about that in the question period. That's the issue of just the practicality of producing energy. But I'm just talking about, this is supposedly, so remember, McKibben, remember this quote, he says, the longer we can delay the transition to the sun, the wind, and myriad other clean ways to power our lives. Well, he names two, and both of them involve this toxic process. So should we call those sources dirty? Yes?
Perhaps this one source, this one company that produces them, but as a whole, there must be other companies that are able to produce it without releasing all the toxins into the environment.
Yeah, so I think there's definitely a lot of truth to that. So the issue is, the point of this example is not to make you hate wind. It's to illustrate something, which is that every technology has certain risks to it. Every technology can be, quote, dirty in the sense of it produces, you're dealing with the earth, you're trying to get certain things you want out of it, and that always leads to byproducts of certain things that you don't want. But the first thought should be, especially if you think this technology has a lot of benefits, should not be, oh, here's a negative, and therefore we throw it all out. But here's a negative, how do we minimize it? Or here's a problem, how do we solve it? And there's a certain fallacy that occurs throughout energy, and that I'm going to argue occurs for tar sands, oil sands, that if you can find something negative about something, if you find some negative aspect, then the whole thing is negative. Or if you can find one dirty aspect, then you should call the whole thing dirty. And my view is, philosophically, this is a fallacy. It's called dropping the context. You need to look at the full context of negatives and positives to evaluate something, whether it's economically, environmentally, etc. And that is exactly what is never done with oil sands, and why people reflexively think that they're dirty. Because all people look at is all of these alleged environmental problems. We can talk more specifically about how big those problems are, but what they don't look at is the, in my view, unbelievable environmental benefits. And you If you are wondering what those are, I'll tell you after I take a sip. So I say environmentally, these are really, really environmentally positive. And often when I say it's confusing because we're never taught to think of stuff like oil or coal or gas, and those are all very related to this issue. They're all kind of the same sorts of argument. We're never taught to think of those as environmentally positive. What we're taught about our relationship between energy and environment is it's basically, it's just one of, we mess it up. It's like nature gives us a good environment and we just dump a bunch of trash in it, and that's our essential thing. And the way we should act is to minimize what we do to nature. So we should do less. So I'm in the bathroom and they put a sign and they're like, use less toilet paper, use fewer paper towels, etc. The whole idea is that the more we do in nature, the worse we make our environment. Now this is actually really, really incorrect. And if we think about environment, and there's another thing from philosophy that's helpful, is thinking really clearly about terms. What is environment? What is our environment? Well, and what does it mean to have a good environment? I think if it means anything, it means to have surroundings that nourish human life, that benefit human life. And I like to call it the human environment, because often when people talk about environment, they talk about the human environment and then they mix it together with the non-human environment. So they say, well, it's bad for, quote, the environment, to drill in Alaska because instead of the caribou walking their natural way, they'll gravitate toward the oil rigs because they like the heat, and that's unnatural and that's bad for the environment. Well, if that argument makes the environment something separate from human beings, and so that's putting the non-human environment over the human environment. So the human environment, certainly, if we talk about that, we take into consideration everything. And you could even take into consideration, depending on the evidence, some claims of something like climate change. But the point is, you think of it in terms of human beings. We always should think about our environment and what's happening to our environment in terms of how does this affect individual, precious, irreplaceable human lives. And if we think about environment this way, one thing it jumps out, which is that the natural environment, absent human industrialization and humans using a lot of energy and humans engaging in a lot of development, is very non-nourishing to human life. And the quickest indication of this is life expectancy. Environment and life expectancy are very closely correlated because environment has to do with things like your health and your safety, susceptibility to disease and susceptibility to climate. And yet throughout history we've had a life expectancy of around 30. And the reason is because the natural environment is not very hospitable to human life. It doesn't give us the climate that we want. I was outside here. I'm from California, so it's just super cold, wherever I go practically. But we're in here and it's perfectly comfortable. Why? Because we have climate control. But throughout history with temperatures like this, people freeze to death all the time. And around the world, people freeze to death all the time for lack of what? Well, for lack of modern energy and modern technology and modern infrastructure. And you see the same thing with things like, so we've got climate, we've got water quality. I mean, we think of, human beings just mess up the water, but we have if you look at water quality statistics and getting sick from water, we have the greatest water anyone has ever had, because naturally water can have all sorts of contaminants in it, can have all sorts of bacteria, all sorts of diseases, and it took human industrialization to do that. Now, the key with this and many other forms of our environment is that all of this industrialization takes energy. Because energy is, at the core, it's our capacity to do work. It's the capacity to get machines to do lots more physical work than we could ever do ourselves. And so the whole standard of living that we have, the whole environment that we enjoy, and as well as the whole economy we enjoy, is based on cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. And there are only 5 knowns throughout all of history. There have only been 5, or depending on how you count, 4.5 sources of cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. Coal, natural gas, oil, nuclear power, and hydroelectric. Hydroelectric is half because it doesn't, there are only so many sites in the world where you can put a dam, so it only works certain places, but where it works very well. Now, oil is particularly special, though, among all of these, and the reason why it's the most desired commodity in the world, the reason it's so contentious, is because it's not only cheap, plentiful, and reliable, but it's portable. And portability is huge because so much of what makes human civilization work is being able to move stuff around. So whether it's a tractor engaging in modern agriculture and dramatically increasing food production, or just the entire network of trucks and cars and planes and trains and automobiles that make modern cities possible. I just came from New York this morning. In New York, without oil, without that modern transportation, that city cannot exist. I mean, it works like clockwork, but only because we have cheap, plentiful, reliable oil. So when we think of oil sands, what we need to think of environmentally is this is the stuff, this is the fuel that moves the whole world, and this is the fuel that creates a truly human environment. And without this fuel, we have a really, really impoverished environment. And if you want to see that, just you can look in history or look in modern places where they have very, very little energy, certainly very, very little oil, and they burn, animal dung for fuel. They burn wood for fuel. You don't talk about air quality. People complain about burning oil for smog. Try sleeping next to an open fire and getting bronchitis when you're 40. So just the ability to have this caliber of portable energy has been a dramatic, dramatic improvement of our environment. And yet, this is never even discussed. Now, let's leave aside the issue of is climate change or is global warming a problem? I'll get to that in a second. But whether you view it as a problem or not, you have to, if you're going to think about the issue objectively, you have to factor into the equation what are all of the positive benefits. And yet, I have never heard one Green Movement member in my life say what I'm saying right here about the environmental benefits of fossil fuels. And when I've said it in lectures or when I've debated people, they just kind of gloss over it. But if you actually care about human life and a human environment, this should be something that you celebrate. And if you think that for some reason there's such a global warming tragedy that you need to stop it, the view shouldn't be, oh, fossil fuels are evil. It would be, God, what a tragedy it is that the thing that's improved our environment so much is ultimately destroying it. And I really hope we can find something as good. But that's not the attitude at all. The attitude is, again, what McKibben said, just very cavalierly saying the transition to the sun, the wind, and myriad other clean ways to power our lives. Now, between the sun and the wind at the moment is the more practical source of energy. And there's a statistic I saw yesterday, or a way of putting it yesterday, which I thought was a good way of putting it. A guy named Matt Ridley, who's a good compiler of this kind of information, said, rounded to the nearest whole number, the percentage of energy production that comes from wind is 0. And that's more than solar. Now, this is another case where I think it's helpful to do some critical philosophical thinking, because often people say, well, it hasn't been given a chance, we need more of a chance. If you look at the history, there's decades and decades of subsidies. Or, well, maybe you'll hear, well, oil is really subsidized, they don't get taxed enough in America, or they don't get taxed enough in Canada, or here's an instance where they got special privileges. But if we think in the big picture, there are countries with no oil production whatsoever and no oil subsidies whatsoever. that use oil. I mean, every country in the world uses oil, and no country in the world produces a substantial percentage of cheap, plentiful, reliable energy, certainly not for transportation, but even for anything, from these other things. And that should point to there's something very unserious about these kinds of claims. If you're gonna say that these are going to replace something like oil, let alone coal, natural gas, nuclear, you're saying sun and wind, and these things are basically 0%, and they've been done for decades and decades and decades, there's really something deeply, there's some sort of corruption there, I think. And what's going on is that everyone who studies energy knows exactly what the reasons are that solar and wind don't produce. They've been the same reasons for decades, and there's no known solution to these problems. One is called the diluteness problem, one is called the intermittency problem. And I'll just be quick. The diluteness problem is basically there's tons and tons of energy in the sun and wind, much more than we could ever use. But it's also true that there's tons and tons of energy in the mass of this building by the equation E equals mc squared. But the problem is we don't know how to use it. So with the sun, you get a lot of energy in the aggregate, but in terms of what you can collect in a given space, it's fairly little. And that means you have to build massive, massive stuff to collect relatively little energy, which costs a lot of money. Ditto with the wind. And then the problem on top of that, and the even bigger problem, is the intermittency problem. So the issue that you need plentiful, reliable energy. You need to have it on demand. And the sun and the wind do not come on demand. And the sun turns off half the day pretty reliably, and then there are clouds and everything else. And of course the wind is completely intermittent. So it's the fact that these are A, more expensive, and B, do not have remotely the reliability necessary. And then C, if you're talking about oil, they don't even produce liquid fuel. I mean, the best you can think of is they could somehow power batteries, which can work for very small cars and little else, because basically batteries can't store as much energy as gasoline can. So this whole thing, the reason I'm just bringing this up is to take a look at how we're thinking about this issue. We're completely ignoring the incredibly positive environmental impact of this stuff on the one hand, and then just sort of completely, just this casual fantasy on the other is a justification for shutting down this pipeline. And for more broadly, for people saying, in Canada, you shouldn't use these oil sands at all. You should just leave them be. You should just leave them in the ground. 175 billion barrels of reserves. Just leave them there because they're bad for environment. Oh, we'll just use sun and wind. This is not serious thinking. And it's not only not serious, it's incredibly destructive. It's not looking at the full context of what benefits the human environment. And I propose the reason is because it is ultimately ideological and really ultimately a religious view that's going on here. It's not that they've taken that the opponents of this have really looked at all of the risks and benefits objectively. It's that they have the view that it's somehow wrong for us to mine the earth and to change things around and use lots of energy, and thus there's this ideal of, well, we should get all of our energy from the sun and the wind and that'll be clean, and they ignore all the mining involved in that. But it's really this thing like, oh, we're not going to exploit the earth, we're just going to let Mother Nature give us whatever energy we can. And the fact is that religion is in direct contradiction to human life and in direct contradiction to the human environment. So it's, in terms of this positive, it is an unbelievable and irreplaceable environmental positive that is completely ignored by the so-called environmentalists. Now, I want to talk about the environmental negatives of oil sands now, because it's important to look at, again, it's important to look at the full picture. So in McKibben, you can read it on Huffington Post, and he gives like 16 reasons. Most of them are distorted, so you should look for other factual sources. But they all fall into the category, many fall into the category of something could go wrong. So for instance, the oil pipeline could leak. And that's true. There's some percentage chance that the oil pipeline could leak. And it's over an important aquifer. And in some routes of the pipeline, it's over an important aquifer. And something could go wrong with the way that they store the waste, and that's also true. But what's telling about this is that these are all just kind of very vague what-if scenarios, and that the attitude toward them is not, these are problems that pale in comparison to the benefits and problems we should solve. We're going to use these negative aspects to call the whole thing a negative. So it's this fallacy of treating something as negative because it has negatives, but just about everything has negatives. Doesn't mean it's negative as a whole. And they completely ignore the fact that this pipeline versus others, because it's more advanced, because it's more technological, has much more safety built into it than just about any other pipeline in history. And the fact that a pipeline, just because of the way it's constructed, is the safest and most reliable and most efficient way to transport oil. So, I mean, this is the scale, I think, is the most striking thing, just that it's these little things, and that any little thing anyone can think of as justification for, again, shutting down this whole thing. This whole thing that's vital to the Canadian economy, the Canadian environment, to the American economy, to the American environment. It's treated as completely dispensable. Now, I mentioned the issue of waste. So there's the waste called tailings with certain forms of it. So 80% of how you get oil sands is something called in situ, which you're basically melting the oil out of it. And then there's another form where you're mining it, and it creates a certain amount of waste. And people look at that and they say, well, look, you had this pristine, oil sands area before, and now you're messing it up, and that's bad for the environment. And again, I'd say, well, bad for whose environment? Because, really, who are those those things are doing nothing before, and now they're improving potentially every single person's lives. I mean, to the extent you're producing more oil, everyone has lower prices for fuel, everyone has lower prices for all kinds of plastics and every other petroleum product. And it leads to all of these phenomena that lead to a better environment. So it's just this incredible thing where by moving a couple of pieces of tar around, basically, that we're doing absolutely nothing, you're creating an incredible bonanza of value. So in terms of the human environment, that's a radical improvement. But if you have this view that it's wrong to change anything, and that changing our environment somehow means destroying our environment, then you're going to view it as bad. But then that's a view of environment that's bad for human life. So, the final thing I want to talk about is the biggest thing by far with this issue of environment, and that is the issue of global warming and greenhouse gases. And I want to stress once again that the full context is being completely ignored here. I indicated before how using energy is so crucial to dealing with climate. And there's some really good statistical data on this by a guy named Inder Goklani, who studied the question, which surprisingly no one studies about, in the 100 years where the US temperature, or the global mean temperature anomaly, as they call it, went up 1 degree, that supposedly indicates this really destructive warming. What happened to climate-related deaths? If we have all this, what has been the record actually so far? And the answer is they went down by 99%. So why did they go down by 99%? Because the fundamental thing about climate is not whether it's 2 degrees warmer or 2 degrees colder, or even whether you have 5% more storms or 5% less storms. It's whether you have the industrial capacity to deal with those things. And the more energy you have, the more capacity you have. That's why Haiti was basically wrecked by an earthquake that would have done very little damage in the United States, because we have a whole industrial capacity built up by lots and lots of energy. And what is the #1 construction fuel? Oil. So again, there's a complete, if you care about climate, even if you think there's a danger from greenhouse effect, you have to acknowledge the contribution of cheap, plentiful, reliable energy to climate livability is immense. It has just completely transformed our relationship to the climate. I mean, we have the term climate control, in our homes and our cars. That is an industrial achievement. So when people talk about catastrophe and climate catastrophe, we have to keep in mind capitalism and energy and oil make catastrophes non-catastrophic. So I keep stressing this, but it's always important to look at what people ignore in their arguments. So if we're talking about human life, the human environment, what benefits human beings, and we're ignoring the livability of climate that's been created by oil and everything else, this is very fishy, that this movement is really objectively concerned about climate and human life. So let's take a look at then the presentation of the actual scientific issues involved. And so the central concept in global warming discussion is what's called the greenhouse effect. And the way we usually hear it is something like this. The greenhouse effect is a proven scientific theory, which is true. More CO2 we emit, the more it's going to warm, the worse the climate is going to get, and then we're going to have catastrophic warming. Well, that is a really misleading argument, and it's deliberately misleading. It's not the people who are making it know that they're being misleading. Because the way we're taught about it, we think, like, I assume a lot of you have seen Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth. Yeah, so he's got a hockey stick, right? So a hockey stick is actually a useful form of graph. Now it turns out Al Gore's hockey stick came from an algorithm by a guy named Michael Mann, which was designed to generate hockey sticks. So it generated for any sort of data. But the hockey stick is actually a really useful graph to describe the impact that oil and fossil fuel usage have had on human life and human environment. But it's not an accurate graph of how the greenhouse effect works on climate, because the greenhouse effect doesn't go like this by itself. The greenhouse effect, what's been proven, is what's called logarithmic effect. So the more CO2 you use, the less impact the greenhouse effect by itself has. And that means that we've been putting all the CO2 in the atmosphere, and we have 99% fewer climate-related deaths. And that's the worst bit. Now even as we use more, it's going to taper off. That would seem pretty good. And yet you never hear this. Now, that's not to say that that's the only thing driving the climate. There are many, many things driving the climate. And the theory of catastrophic global warming depends on the idea that there are what's called positive feedback loops that in spite of the fact the greenhouse effect goes like this, dramatically accelerate it so that it somehow goes like that. And then we need to ask, okay, what's the actual evidence about how proven this is? Has this been proven? Well, one way to prove it would be if you could actually model things accurately. But the climatologists right now, their ability to model these things is horrible. They can't predict anything. The only thing they can do is make a model retroactively and plug in a bunch of variables so that you can explain what happened before, retroactively. But in terms of the ability to predict the future with these hypothetical feedback loops, it's not done. So my point here is not that there are no positive feedback loops, or I can say that for certain. This isn't my field. My field is analyzing the quality and the honesty of people's communication. And the fact that they're taking something extremely hypothetical and putting it forward as settled science and distorting the settled science, again shows that there's something here besides an objective concern for the human environment. And again, it is, I believe, this religious view that it's somehow wrong to change the climate. So they think, well, because we're burning more CO2 and we're having this tiny effect on the climate, or some effect on the climate, that must be bad. And yet when nature changes the climate over hundreds or thousands or millions of years, that's totally fine. It's considered we have this perfect climate given to us, but if we change it even a little bit, it's immoral, and thus they conclude, well, it must be a disaster. But there's no evidence for this. All the evidence is the activities that we've done, to the extent they've changed the climate at all, have led to a far, far more livable and much, much better climate. So, going back to our word association game. My 2 words, which some of you took at least one, my 2 words were awesome and clean. And awesome because, well, I'll do clean first. So, if clean energy means anything, first of all, it has to be a practical form of energy. So, a hurricane has tons and tons of energy in it, but we don't know how to harness that energy. So you can't call it clean energy, just because it's in a natural thing. So solar power, wind power, in the current state of the technology, they don't even really qualify as energy on a mass scale because they're not reliable sources of power. But the other thing is clean. If dirty means anything, it means that it makes for a worse human environment. And if clean means anything, it makes for a better human environment. And no substance that I know of, and no industry that I know of, makes the human environment better than petroleum does. And that, again, doesn't mean that there are no byproducts or no negatives, but that the positives are so overwhelming that we would be completely impoverished economically and environmentally without it. And that's the perspective, I think, that we in the industry should take. It should not be that it's the other side says, oh, you're dirty, and we say, oh, no, we're not quite as dirty as you think. That's complete BS. It's, if anything is clean, if anything makes our world better, it is this kind of technology, including finding revolutionary ways to extract it from like a tar pit, which should be viewed as incredible. That the technology exists and we can get more and more life-giving oil from substances that were previously useless. And this should apply, I think, not just to this pipeline project, although this is a really crucial project, but to all, to all practical energy projects around the world. What the world needs now desperately, what we need, certainly what the third world needs, is more energy. There's 1.5 billion people in the world without electricity. There's so much that we can do, that our lives can be made better by cheaper energy. Certainly people around the world, their life expectancy would go up dramatically. And the fact that we're evaluating our environmental impact and that we're shutting down crucial technologies because of religiously, ideologically motivated bogus weather predictions is really a sham. And it really goes to show that we have not learned how to really value how amazing energy is in our lives. And so that's what I would leave you with. The way the Keystone opponents put it is we have a choice between clean energy and dirty energy. Well, any energy that produces cheap, plentiful, reliable energy and follows the law and doesn't violate property rights, any energy on that scale is clean energy. Any energy is improving human life. So the real choice we face is between energy growth and energy decline, including energy poverty for billions of people. So at the Center for Industrial Progress, we choose industrial progress and energy growth, and I hope you do too. Thank you. Yes?
What about the argument, of course I'm on your side, but I want to, something I read in the press that I want maybe you can explain how
Sure.
this is flawed. There was an argument that was made that the Keystone pipeline was a violation of property rights because they were trying to use the takings clause of the Constitution to eminent domain.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And this is why I wanted to focus on the fundamental issue of the nature of this kind of energy. Because with any modern project, especially the way our laws are configured now, there's lots of dubious things that go on, and this is the thing about the Keystone that I find objectionable. And if there were a movement just objecting to Keystone because of that and demanding that they find a route that respect property rights, I would be in favor of it. Now, this is made, well, I'll just give you a quick historical example, which is one of my favorite examples. In November 1878, a guy named Byron Benson had the idea for the first ever long-distance pipeline. And it was this really revolutionary thing at the time. People at Standard Oil, which is the greatest company in the world, thought that it couldn't be done. It had to accomplish all these technical feats. And 6 months later, the thing was up and running. 6 months later. I mean, today, 6 months, can you open a yoga studio? Probably not. So, but the thing that allowed this to happen is that the fundamental industrial environmental policy was property rights, which protects everyone. So you have a right to acquire land, to do what you want with it, but no one is allowed to pollute your land. And so people had certain safety objections to the pipeline, and it was investigated, and there was no evidence, and it turned out to be safe. But that wasn't allowed to block that, because it was based on property rights and objective law, and there was no eminent domain. So not only did they build this is the cool part, because you had property rights, everyone could build, it's what I like to call industry at the speed of thought. So there's no gap between having an idea and implementing an idea. It was like the computer industry. And so after they built this pipeline and did this proof of concept, they taught the whole world, wow, this is doable, this is the most efficient way. And that made everyone's kerosene cheaper, by the way. And then Standard Oil proceeded to build 3,000 miles of pipe without eminent domain. So this is what happens when you have universal property rights, more or less. One of the problems today, though, is the United States has nationalized, mostly Teddy Roosevelt, in my view, completely unconstitutionally, 1/3 of the land. So that means that you just have all sorts of sections of the country that aren't even an option for someone like TransCanada, to buy. So the whole thing is really, technically it's a fascist system where just the government has control over all the land in the name of, quote, the environment. And it's very hard to say, well, you absolutely shouldn't try to build this pipeline because it's kind of the way you have to do business. But in terms of what we advocate at Center for Industrial Progress, CIP, it's very clear that the fundamental policy is not about Keystone or not Keystone. It's about property rights, because then if you have universal property rights, then you get the best, most fair Keystone equivalent, and you're not driving people off the land, because it's wrong. This is a point Ayn Rand is uniquely good on. She's uniquely good on many things, but this in particular, in this context, that it's not scientific to value collectives over individuals, because there are only individuals. So if there are like 30 individuals and they've worked their whole lives for a house and it's what they love and it's their family, it's not okay to build a pipeline over their land because a lot of other people want it. Might doesn't make right. Their desires don't make it right. And if you have that kind of system, then no one is safe. So it's really, that is the one aspect of this that it's revealing that that's what no one cares about. But I'm glad that you brought it up, because it is an aspect. I just say, because of the current situation, it's hard to hold them at fault. And in this talk, I wanted to stress the things they're being opposed for are the exact opposite of the truth. That is, they're being opposed for wrecking the environment. They're making our environment better. Yes.
Oh wait. So are there any comparisons? I'm with you with respect to the fact that you have to look at it in the greater context and look at the benefits and negatives to whatever source of energy you're using.
Yes.
But do you have a comparison between the byproducts of whatever it requires to make a unit of energy, whatever it is, through the oil sands, as opposed to what it takes to make a unit of energy through wind? Because in your example, you're talking about the byproducts, the localized byproducts in creating this windmill. But once the windmill is in operation, it doesn't require any more, byproducts. Whereas if you're using oil for energy, obviously you need to keep feeding the oil, so you need to keep drilling for the oil. Whereas presumably the windmill will last for a number of years. So I guess how much, when you're talking about these byproducts at the factory for the windmill, how much per unit of energy as opposed to whatever the oil per unit of energy would be. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think there are a couple of important distinctions to make if you're thinking about this issue. So that was just, I was using that example to illustrate the issue of holding the full context. And I like that example because often I think people in the green movement don't think about this issue of the full context, but it sort of pushes one in that direction if it's with one's favored technology to see that, with wind you have to think about the full context. And if you think it's got all these benefits and this thing here, you should think about minimizing the damage, not throwing out, the baby with the bathwater. The general issue is sort of how do you define standards of pollution? So what constitutes pollution? Because you're deciding when should the government intervene to stop something. And today you have, even leaving aside wind, which is a different case for a reason I'll say in a second, but if you take like coal, oil, gas, those have very different, significantly different pollution profiles. I don't regard CO2 as a pollutant for reasons that I said, but if you just take, for instance, air particulate matter, coal definitely has more than oil, which definitely has a lot more than gas, which burns a lot more cleanly. But I still believe that none of those, there should be certain laws about pollution, but I do not believe that any of those should be outlawed. And the reason is because in the current context, they are essential to human life. That is, there is not enough gas or oil to replace all this coal, certainly not on a worldwide basis. Coal is, to the contrary, is desperately needed by billions of people. And if you look at around the world, we have uniquely low gas prices here because we have what's called the shale revolution here. But if you look at the gas price in, say, Asia, it's $15 a unit versus $2 or $3 a unit here. Those people have dramatically improved their lives and their environment despite horrible environmental laws in China, which are unnecessary. But even despite those, they've improved it. So it's the idea of you have to define a law against pollution, which would be a law saying this violates rights, in the context of what is the current state of what is required for human life. And the easiest example is when man came up with fire, you can't say, well, oh, you're not allowed to use fire because you're going to breathe in smoke. But that's pollution in a certain sense. It's an undesirable byproduct. But the point is, the product is so fundamental to life, and there was no means of minimizing it, that it couldn't be. Same thing with coal. When coal came out, it produced fogs and smoke that we would never tolerate today. But at the time, they didn't have the technology to do it. But the great thing is that as technology improves, as we become wealthier, the threshold for what constitutes pollution gets higher and higher. And so even a modern coal plant is extremely clean. A modern American coal plant is extremely clean by the historical standard of just about what anyone ever has had to live around. But with those, I would say the levels of pollution are so low, levels of waste are so low compared to the value, and there's no replacement for those. That's the issue. Now with wind, I have a researcher who thinks that the wind impact is worse. I know some people who think that it's considerably better in terms of the waste. Certainly worse, especially given that it's all farmed out to China. If we were allowed to mine this stuff here, we'd presumably have much better practices. But the main problem with wind is you can't put wind and solar on the same axis that you're putting the practical sources of energy, because they are not in fact practical sources of energy at the moment, as in they haven't been proven to scale to power a whole society. And thus you can't say, so if you could do that, imagine you had like an unlimited ability to produce like solar and wind at 1/4 the price of everything else, with no emissions at all. At that point you might be able to say, you know what, the government could say, well, you know what, that's the new threshold of pollution, because it's possible to build an unlimited amount, so the new threshold is, no emissions. I could see that as a plausible scenario, but we're not near that scenario because it can't produce reliable power. So it hasn't even risen to the category of producing this caliber of energy. All right, again.
So long-term then, what is your view on, oil? I mean, regardless of when you believe it'll, peter out at some point in the future.
Well, the sun will peter out at some point too.
Right, well, presumably oil won't last as long as the sun. But I mean, regardless of how long you think we have to use oil, are you then thinking that technologically we'll be able to adapt to new sources of energy, efficiently? Or, what's the long-term plan?
Yeah, so, fortunately I don't have the responsibility of choosing the energy future of everyone in this room, let alone anyone in the world, because that's impossible and unnecessary. All that's needed is the freedom of people to develop property, to find the best, cheapest, most reliable energy possible, and to have a price system that tells us what is the state of our ability to produce things economically, given supply and demand. So with oil, I don't really care. In an economic sense, I don't particularly care how much oil is, quote, left in the ground. It doesn't matter, because let's say there's 25 or 30 years left. Okay, then the prices will go up, then we'll conserve. That won't be the greatest thing ever, but then that'll accelerate the transition towards substitutes. And already we have natural gas at really, really low prices and really, really new extraction technologies hitting mother loads of energy, and that could very well be a replacement in the sense of, or a large-scale substitute in the sense of you can compress it pretty easily now. They have filling stations, you can liquefy it, which is more compressed but a bit more technical. You can turn it into diesel fuel, which is even more technical and expensive, but could get cheaper. There's the whole phenomenon of nuclear power, which I think has been gutted by the government, could be way, way cheaper than it is now. So there's just unlimited possibility, and we have this amazing mechanism of dealing with relative scarcity of things. But a more philosophical point about it is that, so the price system is what guides us in terms of deciding, what to pursue when and how to plan for the future, and it's brilliant at that. But a more fundamental level, not fundamental, but just an aspect of how resources are, there's too much of a view of nature. So it's just as there's this mother view of nature, like nature gives us, a nourishing environment. No, she doesn't. And there's an idea of nature gives us all these resources. Well, no, she doesn't. Oil was not a resource. It's not. I don't like calling it a natural resource because it's not naturally a resource. It was only really a resource starting in 1859 in the U.S., or some people in Canada will say 1858 in Canada, but that's kind of a historical dispute. So so they used it for torches in Mongolia a long time before that. But oil, like lots of other core resources, is just a raw material that's only useful once human ingenuity figures out how to understand it and harness it. And that was true of coal, that was true of wood for that matter, that was true of natural gas, which just used to be something that killed people in explosions when they were drilling for oil, and is now probably the most coveted fuel in the world, the second most behind oil. Uranium is just a bunch of weird rocks, and that can generate amazing amounts of power. Thorium, ditto for that. So, and who knows what'll come in the future. As I mentioned before, we have Einstein's equation equals mc squared, so the whole world is just matter and energy. The only question is, are we going to have the freedom of human ingenuity to exploit it? And that means keep your hands off our property and keep your hands off our prices. Yes?
So fracking is a great new technology to recover natural gas, which I think is pretty ingenious. But at the same time, on your point about property rights, which I'm also very much believe in strongly, how can we reconcile the fact that in some cases fracking does infringe on somebody's property rights through the weakening of the ground? I know there have been cases resulting in lawsuits where the fracking process has destroyed the land of another person. Do you have any comments on that? How can we reconcile the two?
But I have to remind, Derek, can you pass out my sign-up sheet?
Yeah, sure.
So we have a newsletter that tells you lots of amazing stuff about energy, so sign up. That's not my answer to fracking. But we do talk about fracking in that. With the fracking stuff, a lot of it is, there's a lot of just made up stuff. But there's definitely an issue of if you can prove that someone else is harming your property, I mean, if you can prove that they have harmed it, you have legal recourse. And if you can prove that they're really threatening it, you can file an injunction. But what people want, but it's helpful to look at this on a macro level. So think about say the charge that it pollutes groundwater. Fracking pollutes groundwater. There are various technical reasons why this is a very big distortion, but if you just think on a macro level, who's died from drinking fracked water? 0 people. And yet we're talking about a technology that's improving millions and millions of lives, but people are willing to throw it out for these accusations about water, and you see someone on YouTube light water on fire, and oh my God, you can light water on fire, it must be fracking, even though you can light water on fire any time in history because natural gas naturally seeps into water all the time. So all of these things are taking very individualized cases, whether real or distorted, and extrapolating to bans. So they should be dealt with on an individualized basis. And I mean, I don't have too much to say about the ground, except fracking occurs 6,000 feet underground. So the issue of it really destroying people's ground seems like it would be very dubious and very unlikely.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because when you read the articles, it almost seems like 2 meters below the ground, the rock has been totally eroded, but it sounds like...
No. I mean, the stuff that happens is usually going to be, that's going to go wrong is usually just in sticking a drill in the ground at the surface. Water is very near the surface, so, something can go wrong there. But that's true of any form of drilling, any form of activity, certainly true of, dealing with those materials for windmills. But there has to be this fundamental realization, this is not a value that's on the table to sacrifice. It's just an issue of how to protect people's rights best. But instead it's, if we can make any stupid documentary like Gasland, then we should ban it in New York or Pennsylvania.
Right.
And that's the mentality today, but it's because, they have this fallacy of treating something as negative because it has negatives, but more fundamentally, not placing a positive value, having a completely wrong non-human view of environment that doesn't place a value on energy and development. And to the extent we have that, all of these concerns really get put in place.
I have a question.
Yes.
The person you debated in your debate video, the Greenpeace representative,
Yes.
he said that in the 50s, 1% of the U.S. government's budget overall was to nuclear subsidies. And there's this, and apparently all forms of new energy have been subsidized. So there's this narrative that solar power and wind power haven't been subsidized very much. So if they're ever going to work, they don't work now, or don't work well now, but they're still developing. So if we just subsidize them a bit more, like we did with nuclear, we subsidized it a lot, then it'll work next week. So what do you have to say?
I assume the next week is a bit sarcastic. This is, what great industries come about by subsidies? Let's just look at the major sources of energy today. 85% of the world's energy comes from coal, oil, and natural gas. Okay, was James Watt given excessive subsidies for coal? Was Edwin Drake given excessive subsidies for drilling the first oil well in America? No. He had $2 left, and he was basically broke. Natural gas, this is a phenomenon of the modern oil industry. So, it's true that, it's certainly true that the government certainly put a lot of money into nuclear. But the question is, what do we do with that? Did that help nuclear, or did it hurt nuclear? I'd say overwhelmingly it hurt nuclear, that the government was so involved in it, and it created this whole impression that nuclear power is uniquely dangerous and needs to have all of these extra controls on it. And it's basically made the nuclear industry an appendage of the government. So I think it's been it's been tremendously harmful. Now, but to the extent it was involved in the war effort, I mean, to the extent there was crossover technology with the Manhattan Project, that's great. I mean, if we can get any ancillary benefit from military stuff, obviously, we should take it. And today, if we can get any benefit from past subsidies, we should take it, because a lot of people suffered to pay those subsidies, so we might as well maximize the benefit. But the point is today, as much as possible, you know, you don't right wrongs by by just giving a bunch of new subsidies to a completely unpromising technology that has also been completely subsidized throughout the world. So it's just a lie that it hasn't been subsidized. But there's this very wrong view that subsidies, that the path to making something really economic is for someone to just give you a whole bunch of money, and then you're going to somehow make it. Lots of businessmen, I think this. Like, oh, if only someone would give me $1 billion, like then I would be able to beat the iPhone. But the thing is, you still have to make a profit. It has to be that you sell more than you spend, like on a per unit basis. You still have to solve that basic problem, and you have to do that with something that's better than anything else in the market. And you can give solar $1 trillion, but there's no evidence that it'll do that. And if you give them $1 trillion, that's $1 trillion you could have spent on oil. Yes?
Where would I go to find information on the pipeline itself and what technological safeguards they have against, say, oil spills?
Well, I mean, it depends how biased you consider them, but you can look at the TransCanada website. I mean, that's the company.
Have you observed any false alternative, like overconfidence on one side as to oppose the irrational fear on the other?
Can you tell me what that would mean?
Well, drill, baby, drill seemed to be like a college rally, college football rally kind of spirit, and it didn't seem to get us anywhere. It may have contributed to the Gulf oil. We may have moved too quickly and not taken the precautions that should have been there. Have you observed any movement in that regard?
Well, it kind of relates to the point I made before about just, you have the government controlling a lot of things that should be controlled by private individuals. So even with the land offshore, underwater, it was controlled by the MMS, which now changed its name to something more environmental friendly. But forget which M came first, but minerals and mining, that branch of the government. So, I mean, in general, the more you have a system where it's this government regulation, what happens is the government doesn't know, with, let's say, a nuclear plant, the government doesn't really know what is going to be safe for a nuclear plant. The only way it can really know is retroactively. It's not like it has the most brilliant nuclear safety people. Those people are going to be the people in the industry and the people designing stuff. So when you have this preventative system, what happens is there's always this bias toward either you have this bias toward not doing new things, or you sort of allow new things in a very blind way, and you specify these regulations, and sometimes the companies will make sure to do safety stuff, and sometimes they won't. And so in general, it leads to a decrease in safety. So that can happen. But I would say with the Gulf oil spill, I find it outrageous how much this has been used to discredit safety in oil drilling. I mean, this is offshore oil drilling. It's one of the safest things you can do. If you want to be safe for a day, go on an offshore oil rig. It is true with a lot of these things. I mean, nuclear power plant is the safest place to work. And I mean of anything. I mean it is safer than my job sitting at a desk or even standing up here. Like the amount of technology and safety, along with the amount of value that's being produced, is so staggering. And yet, what happens? The tragedy is 11 people die in an explosion. That's really what I care about. But everyone's just, they're showing like, oh my God, birds are dying. How can we allow ourselves to use oil? Are you kidding me? And this is benefiting every American to use oil, including offshore oil. And I mean, how many birds are killed by windmills? How many birds are killed by cats? No one cares. They're completely just focused on hatred of oil and finding a way to oppose it and having this view again that if we change nature, it's bad. Well, guess what? In the whole project of industrializing and making our lives 100 times better, yeah, you're going to spill some stuff. And yeah, you look and you try to learn, you try to learn from those mistakes. But to use like a mistake of that size compared to the benefit and to use it to impugn a whole industry just shows that we place no value on industry. And I don't want to be cynical and say we deserve what we get, but we need to change. So let's put it as it's my job and everyone's job to change that. But in a positive way. I mean, the most important thing is they have to have that positive value of how amazing it is to improve human life through energy production and development. And then they'll have a rational reaction to something like an oil spill instead of a destructive one where we're destructing our future. And in the US anyway, we're destroying our future capacity to produce oil. I really want to plant a question about conflict oil. Go ahead.
I just, so you kind of, I've been just typing notes of what you were saying. In terms of, so you're sort of presenting that there's an information war, more deliberate information, against oil. I guess, how do you address the hyperbolized or dramatized dangers of wildlife impact? Because obviously, if I'm not a scientist or I'm not in the industry and I'm just your everyday Joe Schmo and I'm confronted with this issue, I'm obviously envisioning, well, if the Gulf oil spill can, cause one bird or whatever, a small percentage of animals to suffer wildlife damage, whatever. Obviously in my mind that's instantly gets extrapolated into a scary what if where that, can one day be a much larger scale event.
Wait, you mean a bigger spill or there's somehow going to be some ripple effect?
Ripple effect. So how do you combat that perception? Because that's a natural kind of maybe a fallacy, but it's a natural argument that in my head would form if it can happen on a small scale, and if the scale of production gets bigger, then the chance proportionately gets bigger of the impact. So how do you combat that perception?
Well, I mean, oil is already on a huge scale of production, and the number of accidents on offshore drilling is essentially zero. I mean, it's a rounding error to zero. But I want to comment on the issue of it being kind of natural to think this way, because I think it's unnatural to think this way. I think it's based on this anti-human bias we have toward environment. So you mentioned wildlife. Who kills all the wildlife? Wildlife kills wildlife. Right? I mean, come on. That's what nature does. It's a competitive system. Species are killing each other all the time. They're knocking each other extinct all the time.
Well, you can't just say that there's no environmental impact in terms of industry. There is, right? So if you're affecting keystone species, for example, right, and it's a man-made conflict, you seem to be just shoving that aside and not really addressing it.
But what I'm saying is that, I didn't shove it aside in my talk. I mentioned that you should factor in whatever affects human life, and that's important. What I'm pointing out is that there doesn't seem to be any. There's a double standard, and humans are getting the worst of it, which is so bad in my view. That no people think about we killed some birds, and yet they don't care that cats kill all of these birds. They don't care that.
Okay, but there's a difference. One is artificial and one is natural. If 200,000 dolphins start throwing themselves in Norway...
How am I not natural?
Okay, that's more of a epistemological
argument. That's my turf. This is a philosophical issue. Yeah, you're damn right. It's epistemological in the sense of you're treating natural as a good thing and artificial as a bad thing, or at least having some value significance. You're certainly not saying artificial is better. So what I'm saying is human beings are a part of nature. We are the most superior species in nature. So every species in nature tries to exploit its surroundings to maximize its benefit. Human beings for a while weren't doing the greatest job of that. Fortunately, we were able to use our minds, discover science, causal connections, figure out how to command nature, we started taming it, agriculture, all this good stuff. Finally had this amazing thing called Industrial Revolution, and we became by far the superior species on the planet. Now all those other species are trying to kill each other and prevail. We just happen to be much better at it. And so the question is, at any point do you say that we do it is somehow wrong because we're the best? No, I want Michael Jordan in the NBA, and I want him to be able to succeed. And as human beings, certainly I want us to be able to succeed, because we're not succeeding enough for my taste. You just go to New York. I was in New York the other day. It's an amazing city, but there are poor people all over the place. People still working in drudgery. The more energy, the more industry, the more progress we have, the less the burden on their lives, the more machines can do work for us, the more can be produced. I think we're nowhere near, there's no end to progress, and thus there's no end to the superiority of our species. Now part of that is that we can enjoy and have good relations with the other species. It's really nice to have a pet dog, and wildlife preserves can be really great, and there's all sorts of wonderful stuff you can do, but it has to be, the focus has to be, it has to benefit humans, because if it's not, if the focus is not on benefiting humans, it's sacrificing humans. That's
okay, but sorry to interrupt, but there's a tipping point where not mitigating the environmental impacts will in the end encircle impact us, because we are at the end of the day, yes, we're using oil, but just as much as we're using oil, we rely on food, we rely on agriculture, right? And at some point, these things circle back, and if they have a very sizable environmental impact, then down the line, suddenly all these fish die out. You don't have a fish industry, right? How do you address that? Or is that a myth?
That's a construct. It's not, so in the same way, like,
it's not just a contract. It has
it's a construct
practical.
In the sense of, you made a circle with your hand, right, and then you said that there's it's going to encircle us and come back, and there's this idea that, if we use nature too much, it's going to come bite us. Where's the evidence for that? It's the evidence, nature is a competitive system. So the way it works is that the better competitor you are, the better off you are. And because we're intelligent, we can find tons and tons of ways to substitute for all sorts of different things. Now what happens is the people who believe that it's wrong to change nature are trying to constantly come up with versions of hell, basically, that we are going to go to if we keep, the current one happens to be it's going to get really hot, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so they completely distort that because the facts don't justify as much as they would like. And they'll say things like, oh, if you kill this fish and it's going to die out and then it's going to have all these ripple impacts and then you won't be able to eat. This is just all imaginary. And the thing that's important is that everything be privatized as much as possible so that these things are important, but human reason is demonstrated to be completely capable of continually maximizing our welfare. And where people do stupid things, it's because they're not allowed to own property and use reason. But there is no inevitable collapse of capitalism or reason or development. There's no tipping point. These are all just words that are constructs that completely defy reality. So it's certainly true that there are many people with this theory of the world. This theory happens to just have no basis and be the opposite of the last 200 years of evidence. And even if there was some problem like global warming, it wouldn't refute it because we would be able to cope with it using reason. So we would be able, we might be able to find a way to cool the earth. We could scale up nuclear power, which incidentally the anti-global warming people hate more than anything else, even though it doesn't generate CO2. We have all sorts of rational options. And that's so that the fundamental is the freedom to change the world, to transform nature to meet our needs using reason, and that includes adapting to to mistakes or to byproducts or to anything else. Yes?
So are you suggesting that the market then will solve the problem of the tragedy of the commons? Because it would seem to me, in light of what the gentleman up there said, that, if you just expect private industry to do what's best for humans, the competitive nature of it will mean that everyone tries to outdo the other. And if government hadn't stepped in with the Atlantic fishery, for example, we might not have any fish left in the Grand Banks. If somebody doesn't, at some point, would the particulate matter in the atmosphere not reach a tipping point that would cause, these ripple effects to species that we rely on to eat or to, places we live, that, a private company isn't necessarily going to be looking at that big picture because of this tragedy of the commons and the fact that everybody's just going to look at their own business. So how does
Okay, Leah, let me address tragedy of the commons, and then I think you've got a real bias toward private companies, which I think.
Well, I mean, I don't.
Which I want to. No, but hold on, because the tragedy of the commons is a phenomenon of not defining property rights. It's a phenomenon of you have some collective area that no one has any right to, and so people pursue it in a very short-range way because none of them is really responsible for the consequences. This is why all the different things I posited in terms of laws against pollution and property rights, it's all based on you being able to own property and then you being protected by virtue of your property rights. So your property rights are a limit on the action of others. Their rights are defined by the rights of others. But it doesn't matter. I don't know why you're picking on companies. I mean, it's because individuals can certainly just wreck stuff too. They can do stupid things. They can ruin fisheries. Whether they're one big company or lots of little individuals not working together.
To be fair, I'm not picking on companies. I'm suggesting that in a capitalist system, everyone's looking out for themselves, and they're not necessarily going to look out for the common area. And for better or worse, the atmosphere is not something over which we have property rights. I mean, the air in my backyard.
If there were really a serious, and I'll take that. If you could really prove that there were this deathly threat, you could make the atmosphere into property rights. I mean, that would be one way of tackling the issue. Think about spectrum, the way we have right now. I mean, people are only allowed to use certain portions of spectrum. Now, it's not quite properly defined, but there's the basic idea, okay, I can broadcast on this frequency, and then I own this frequency. And the idea would be, well, people would only have a right to a certain amount of, the idea would be the atmosphere can only handle so much CO2, and at some point, it becomes this collective disaster. Let's say that really the whole planet was going to become a fireball. Yeah, then you would really it would be an emergency situation, and one way to do that would be to treat it as the atmosphere can only handle so much CO2 for human life. Now, this is all pseudoscience at this point.
I'm not talking about CO2. That's a different issue. I mean, CO2 is...
But what are you worried about? Because everything else in the atmosphere has been lessening dramatically.
Well, I mean, I look out my window, and on a hot day, the atmosphere looks brown from... I mean, you can see particulate matter that's... there's a chemical reaction in the atmosphere, and that's... that if I go into my backyard and I take a breath, I mean, there's stuff there that has been shown to aggravate things like asthma and whatnot. So there is a tipping point at which, health is affected by stuff in the atmosphere. Not, this is completely different from global warming.
Okay, I got that. But then that pertains to my answer to your earlier question, which is the issue that at any given stage, you can't say a byproduct, you can only classify it as pollution if in the full context it's harmful to human life. So if the thing that produced it is completely essential right now, then you can't say, oh, I saw some brown and I'm 1% more likely to get asthma, therefore you have to shut down all the coal plants, because then the hospitals aren't going to be able to run, or whatever other dramatic impacts you're going to have. What you can say, though, is that there's this general trend toward, as you get better and better technology, you can have higher and higher standards. But the whole thing is, again, the full context of what benefits, what is essential for human life, and you can't just say, here's a byproduct I don't like, therefore it's not allowed. Because then life shouldn't be allowed.
But you do think that at any particular point, depending on our technology and what's practical, the state does need to set some kind of standard for pollution?
Yeah, you have laws about it. I mean, there's a question of how the standards get set, which is a project. I mean, there's a lot of theories on it, but choosing among those theories is something I'm working on at the moment in terms of the best way to do that. But philosophically, the issue is, can you say, I mean, there's obviously certain amounts of pollution that are rights violation on a one-to-one basis, like, you dump sewage on my yard, and there can be such and then there's a question of, okay, what's the pollution for a coal plant that's far away? And then if you have anything that is more aggregating in nature, then there's a question of how to deal with it. But this issue of the full context of what human life and human health require, that's the essential ingredient to making a rational policy.
But
Yes.
I was going to say that during the 19th century, 18th century, when, with industrial progress, I mean, the streets were paved with manure, and there were animals all over the place, and people were dying of diseases as a result of being in contact with animals. And so now we have paved roads, and there's lots of, our pollution standards are getting better and better and better as our technology becomes better and better and better. So I think that, when we look at things very myopically, and we just look at, how things are right now, we should think and project 100 years from now, or 200 years from now, would we have thought that, internet would be possible 100 years previously? So, I mean, I think that as technology progresses, I think these concerns are just going to go away.
Yeah, that's a great example, and it reminds me of just how I think about, I mentioned the full context, but one way of thinking about it is so what considerations go into the full context. One is always being really clear about what your purpose is. So if we're talking about environmental issues in the full context, the question is, what are we after? And we have to be really clear about human environment, non-human environment. I said, environment that really nourishes human life. But then there's the issue of what are the benefits and hazards of something, and then but you always have to remember what are the benefits and hazards of the alternatives. So with the automobile, people could say, oh, I don't like this exhaust coming out the back, but as you pointed out, what are the alternatives? The alternatives are, having these piles of horse manure carrying disease, much slower transportation, not nearly the economic benefits that are made possible by having an automobile, not nearly the personal freedom that's made possible, ultimately not nearly the affordability that's made possible. So it's, in economics and philosophy, you're always thinking about alternatives. Let's think about the full context, and then how does this alternative, if you say like this is bad, well, bad compared to what? Because if you just take one aspect of something and say, oh, this is a bad aspect, so it's bad, that is not real thinking. You had something?
Yeah, just a comment how most people here are mentioning about humans destroying the environment minus humans. And no one ever looks at, for example, the natural environment, let's call it, destroying itself. Like if when a volcano erupts and then you'll have particulate matter and like that brown smog. But that's natural brown smog, so why aren't you complaining about that? Why aren't we saying, oh, ban volcanoes, ban ice ages, right? The natural environment is changing itself, so how come that's not an issue, but when people do it, it is?
Because people have a notion of responsibility. Some people.
Responsibility to who?
Yes, who's sick?
Does nature have a responsibility to nature? Whether it be a volcano
There's two issues here. I mean, one is obviously human beings are in the realm of choice. So there is the issue. I don't use the term ocean of responsibility, but there is the issue of we can choose things and we should choose to minimize damage. Now it should be in the full context and not shutting down oil pipelines and stuff like that. But what I think is really important about this issue, and related to what I was trying to indicate several times in the talk, is this double standard in terms of how, like, the emotional response to it and how its impact is viewed and how much attention is paid to it. So this is the way I think of it. Like, all things being equal, if humans cause a bunch of brown stuff by producing a lot of energy that makes them happy and alive longer, that's a hell of a lot better than, if I could choose, than a volcano doing it and me getting nothing in return. Right? So the way I think of it is this. If you take the green movement and climate change, if you had the exact same amount of climate change, but it was, quote, natural, as in it didn't have to do with human beings, I would bet all of my future earnings that they would not be nearly as hostile to it as they are if it's caused by humans. And yet, how perverse is that? Because if the climate changes in a negative direction and we're not producing anything, then we get no benefit out of it. But if we're producing tons of energy from coal and get the same change, then we get lots of great stuff. So it should, really the perspective should be the opposite of what you're observing in the culture. Like if humans do something and it has a bad byproduct or something we'd rather not have, we should at least celebrate we're getting so much value out of it. Versus when nature, I was going to say screws us over, that just stinks. I mean, it's an unmitigated negative, but so there's a real anti-human thing. Human beings need to learn how to have self-esteem about being human beings. And it's taken a lot of time. It's still in progress.
Sorry, one last thing.
Yes.
If I could. So you bring up the idea of the big picture, the full context, so in my previous question when I brought wildlife, you kind of implicitly treat the impact as trivial as compared to the benefits, or it's collateral damage, and you're trying to kind of frame the argument as a more philosophical misconception. However, there are currently environmental impacts of industry that are causing entire diasporas in South Asia of people to move away from from areas of development because of the environmental impact. So, which brings me back to my original question of how do you mitigate that negative perception of, this is a danger and, possible tar sand development could lead to, how do you mitigate that is the real question. Like, I understand that that's the wrong perception to have, but that's how people approach it if they're not educated about the issue, right?
Well, I just want to say about wildlife, I think that should be a private issue of people creating. I mean, people have created private wildlife preserves. If the government hadn't nationalized everything, they would definitely do that. I mean, it's the kind of thing that the enjoyment of nature is a very important thing, but it's a high level value. It's a higher order good, not higher order, but it's just a high level good economically in the sense of it takes a lot of wealth and a lot of industrialization, a lot of energy to go and enjoy nature. When you live in the same place your whole life because you don't have modern transportation, you can't move 5 miles, you're not enjoying nature, even if it's a really nice spot. I've been able in my life to enjoy a lot of really beautiful places. The Grand Canyon, I've flown over places, even flying is just an amazing way to enjoy nature, but that is such a modern industrial achievement that to criticize industry, I'm not saying you are, but many people criticize industry in that connection. And then even there's a sort of a division of wildlife that's for pleasure, but just forms of life that we benefit from in terms of food or medicine or other things like that. And those are all, again, those have commercial value. So obviously they're going to be pursued rationally under proper rights. So that's one thing. Now, in terms of this issue of Asia, there's this broader claim with global warming that attributes everything that nature ever does that's bad, now it's all global warming's fault. So that's this whole mentality. So if anything happens to any people where they have to be displaced, then it's global warming's fault. So part of it is there's a lot of pseudoscience. But the other part is when people are always talking about, the West has this responsibility to the third world because it's going to be the hardest hit by bad global warming. Well, of course it's going to be the hardest hit, but why is that our fault? Like, why don't they get their act together and actually start creating like a modern civilization that respects individual rights and allows them to industrialize? I mean, Asia has started to do this, India has started to do this, a couple countries in Africa have started to do this, but you just have primitive lifestyles and incredibly self-destructive lifestyles that are incredibly vulnerable to the climate and that just don't sustain life very well. So what happens is we become hyper-climate sensitive. Everything in the climate is blamed on global warming. And people notice, wow, these guys aren't doing so well when it gets hot. And they're not doing so well when it gets cold. They're not doing so well when it snows. They're not doing so well when it floods. Well, it's because they're not industrialized. But why isn't the focus on industrialization? And then beneath that, it has to be proper governance. And no one is doing anyone a favor by acting like the rest of the world is a victim and we're the villain. We're the hero. They should ask us for a copy of the Constitution and follow it to the letter. Everyone would be a lot better off. It's time for American self-esteem too.
When I used to work in McKinsey Consulting, and we had a project in India where all these people would ride motorcycles, and they would have a family of people on their single motorcycle with all their kids on that one thing, and then eventually they started making a cheap enough car that enough people in India could afford it, started buying it. So yes, everyone touted, this is great economic success, it's a great project, it's lots of Western investment. Down the line, those same cities right now are empty. that had those cars implemented simply because of the technological impact. So again, the perception is, you know, if you don't have structures in place to mitigate the environmental impact and to address that in a accessible way to people who are not scientifically aware, then they will look at those examples, and that's part of that perception of, you know, the fear.
It's definitely important to look at these examples and interpret them the right way. So if you want to write a good blog post for us on how to interpret it properly, I'm serious. We have people write those kinds of things all the time. My old boss used to fine people $250 for that. But I don't have that authority, unfortunately. So the issue is really understanding what a property right is. So it's certainly true that in a government where you just, we don't have property rights really in this country anymore. We have either the government owns stuff or you privately own stuff, but in either case the government can come in any time and say, the quote, the environment demands that we seize your property for X, or the environment demands that you not be allowed to do Y. And that is a completely destructive policy in two ways. It A, prevents a lot of development from occurring, and it B, allows lots of destructive things to happen, and even more so in much less civilized countries with much less rich traditions of rule of law, where the government is like the environmental policeman. It controls everything instead of individuals controlling their own land and minding it for real threats to their own human environment. But when that doesn't exist, you do all you just grease the wheels for all sorts of short-range things. So when you misdefine or don't define property rights, short-range behavior is the rule. Short-range behavior by the government, which is what public choice theory is all about, which is an interesting field of study, and then short-range behavior by people whom the government has made it in their interest to exploit others. It's basically said, you have a license to pollute. Well, if you give out licenses to pollute, then you get a lot of pollution. But property rights takes away all the licenses to pollute.
We're going to get kicked out in like 3 or 4 minutes, so we got to wrap up.
Conflict, though, you were saying.
Oh, God.
I don't think you have time to answer that one.
Can I do 30 seconds?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't like, Ezra Levant I really like, but be careful of arguments that the justification for being free to develop tar sands is that it's somehow going to free us of Mideast terrorism. One thing you need to understand about oil is it's a global market. Whether we buy oil from Saudi Arabia or from Canada, Saudi Arabia gets basically the same oil price. Because if we buy it from Canada, then instead of Saudi Arabia, what happens is Saudi Arabia's price goes down a little bit because we're not buying it, and then someone else buys from Saudi Arabia because it's a global market. So there's just lots of mumbo jumbo about this. Now, that's not to say Levant, to his credit, is pointing out real problems with these regimes that need to be addressed, but they need to be addressed by good foreign policy, not sort of used as a poor rationalization for environmentally amazing things that need no rationalization.